The fall from grace. The planet Duraxis 9 was a forsaken world where even the dust seemed to bite. Its red storms never ceased, and its twin suns burned with merciless intensity. Few beings ever came here willingly, only the desperate, the broken, or the banished. Emberclaw was all three. He lay motionless in a crater of his own making, his once magnificent scales now dulled and cracked like old leather. Centuries ago, his name had been whispered in terror across star systems. He was the crown jewel of King Velair's armada, a pale-skinned, ember-veined dragon of titanic proportions whose flames could melt battle cruisers and whose roar could shatter moons. But that was before. Before the comfortable life of ceremonial flights and staged battles had softened his edges. Before his legendary hunger for destruction had been replaced by a hunger for rich foods and lazy afternoons. Before his mighty frame had grown thick with fat and his reflexes had slowed to a crawl. The day of his disgrace still burned in his memory. King Velair had ordered a bombing run on the rebel moons, and Emberclaw simply couldn't rise. His massive body, weighted down by years of excess, remained grounded while smaller, hungrier dragons took to the skies in his place. The laughter from the royal court still echoed in his mind. Velair's decree had been swift and merciless: burn the records. He is no longer of the royal line. Leave him on Duraxis 9. Let the worms have him. They had dragged him here like cargo, dumped him in this crater, and left without ceremony. No chains, no guards, no final words of contempt. Just abandonment. Now, as the storm winds howled around him, Emberclaw stared at the twin suns that no longer seemed to acknowledge his presence. His fire still burned somewhere deep inside, but it was buried beneath layers of shame, doubt, and the crushing weight of his failures. He had tried to fly once, shortly after his exile. The attempt had broken his left wing in 2 places. He never tried again. Time moved differently on Duraxis 9. Days blended into nights, storms into stillness. His scales continued to crack, his inner fire continued to dim, and still, no one came. Until the day the sky split open and spit out a falling star. The unlikely meeting. The falling object wasn't a comet or a warrior's cruiser. It was a battered escape pod held together with duct tape, carbon strips, and what sounded like creative cursing in several languages. The craft crashed 2 ridges away from Emberclaw's crater, rolled twice, and came to rest with a final, defeated hiss. Emberclaw barely lifted his massive head to watch. After months of solitude, even a crash landing felt like distant entertainment. Then he saw the creature emerge. Small, bipedal, limping. Covered in grease, sweat, and wearing a torn jacket with faded lettering that read "Trainer." The human struggled under the weight of an oversized pack and carried a silver whistle that caught the sunlight like it still believed in hope. The man was clearly not a warrior or conqueror. He moved with the careful steps of someone who had survived many crashes but expected to survive many more. His name, though Emberclaw didn't know it yet, was Dax Teen. Dax had spent his career as a rehabilitation trainer for decommissioned military equipment, everything from retired assault mechs to former war bears who needed help adjusting to civilian life. He understood pain, recognized shame, and knew the difference between something that was broken and something that had simply forgotten how to work. As he approached the massive dragon in the crater, Dax could see that this creature wasn't dangerous anymore. It was ashamed. Emberclaw watched the humans approach with one yellow eye, half bored, half hoping this might finally be his end. The man was so small he could have been crushed by accident. Instead, Dax stopped in the dragon's shadow, wiped his cracked goggles clean, and spoke with the calm certainty of someone used to being ignored. "You're not done yet." Emberclaw snorted, releasing a puff of smoke that smelled of disappointment and old ration packs. The human didn't flinch. Instead, Dax tossed a protein bar at the dragon's feet. "You've got more fire in you than half the stars I've crashed through," he said matter-of-factly. "If you want to rot here, I'll leave you to it. But if you want to move again, even just one claw, then I'm your guy." The dragon didn't answer, but he didn't incinerate the protein bar either. That night, as Duraxus Nine's infamous storms howled across the wasteland, Dax unrolled his dented sleeping bag between Emberclaw's massive paws. He trusted the dragon more than the weather, and somehow, that trust wasn't misplaced. When morning came, Emberclaw had shifted slightly, just enough to shelter the small human from the wind with one massive wing. It wasn't surrender. It was the first step. Dax woke with frost in his beard and a grin on his face. Good, he whispered to himself, looking up at the dragon who had protected him through the night. We start with stretches. First steps to recovery. The first week was hell, and Dax knew it had to be. Emberclaw's limbs had become sluggish pillars of scar tissue and accumulated weight. Every joint cracked like a failing engine when he moved, and his breathing came in labored wheezes that spoke of a body pushed far beyond its limits. But Dax never mocked him. Not once. He gave commands with the same steady calm as a river cutting through stone, patient, relentless, never barking orders but always certain the dragon could follow them. Stand, Dax would say, his voice cutting through the howling wind. Emberclaw would snarl, blow ash into the air, and turn away in frustration. Stand, Dax would repeat, rolling his shoulders as sweat poured down his back. The planet's crushing gravity and intense heat made every moment a struggle, but he never wavered. On the third day, Emberclaw managed to lift one massive leg before collapsing in a thunderous heap that shook the ground for miles. Dax clapped anyway. Progress, he said, spitting protein dust from his mouth. You'll be crushing mountains by the end of this. Emberclaw didn't believe him, but something deep inside, the part that remembered real war, where every breath meant survival and every roar had purpose, began to tremble awake. The dragon started watching Dax's movements more carefully. When the human bent his knees in demonstration, Emberclaw found himself mirroring the motion. When Dax jogged around the crater's edge, dragging salvaged metal rods from his crashed pod, Emberclaw's tail began to flick in rhythm. Then came the breakthrough. On the seventh day, as Dax completed his morning routine, Emberclaw deliberately flexed one massive wing to its full span. The membrane was cracked and caked with ash, but it was still wide enough to block out both suns when fully extended. It wasn't flight, but it wasn't defeat either. Dax dropped his pack, hands on his hips, staring in reverent silence. Then he grinned like a man who had just witnessed a miracle. Now that, he said softly, was beautiful. That night, for the first time since his exile, Emberclaw didn't lie down in the sand. He sat upright, his great head raised toward the stars, waiting for morning to come so they could continue. The transformation had begun, and both dragon and trainer knew there was no turning back. The real training begins. Dax crafted a gymnasium from the bones of failure itself. He strapped weights made from broken shuttle panels to Emberclaw's powerful forelimbs. He built obstacle courses from twisted wreckage and jagged rock formations. Energy resistance bands stretched between charred meteors were roped to the dragon's massive horns, creating tension exercises that would have challenged a battle mech. And Emberclaw, the once feared Skyfire of legends, obeyed, not out of servitude, but because he desperately wanted to become something again. Each roar that had once scattered entire armies was now released as a primal grunt, echoing through valleys in rhythm with every step, every lift, every controlled landing. The sound wasn't of rage anymore, but of effort, of a being pushing against the limits of what seemed possible. As the weeks passed, something remarkable began to happen. The accumulated ash and dead scales started to shed like old skin, revealing glimpses of the silver hide that had once gleamed in starlight. Emberclaw's movements became more fluid, his breathing less labored. The fire that had been buried deep within began to flicker closer to the surface. Dax pushed him harder, sensing the dragon's growing strength. Again, he would shout over the wind as Emberclaw practiced wing-assisted leaps across the crater. Higher. You're not some earthbound lizard, you're meant to own the sky. The training became more complex. Precision landings on narrow rock spires. Sustained flame bursts that tested his internal furnace. Aerial maneuvers that required both wings working in perfect coordination despite the old injuries. Each success brought Emberclaw closer to remembering who he used to be. But more importantly, it helped him discover who he could become. One evening, as they rested after a particularly grueling session, Dax looked up at the dragon who now sat with obvious pride in his posture. "You know," the trainer said, cleaning his goggles, "I think you're ready for the real test." Emberclaw's great head tilted in question. Dax pointed toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered around the planet's highest peak. "Tomorrow, we climb Mount Paraxis. And then..." He grinned. "Then you're going to fly again." The dragon's eyes blazed with inner fire for the first time in years. He was no longer the broken creature that had been abandoned here. He was becoming something new, something stronger than he had ever been before. Rise of the Phoenix Dragon. Mount Paraxis rose from Duraxis 9's surface like a dagger thrust into the heart of the sky. Its peak disappeared into the storm clouds that perpetually crowned the planet, and its slopes were littered with the bones of creatures that had tried and failed to reach its summit. The climb took 3 days. Emberclaw moved with purpose now, his massive claws finding purchase on rocky ledges that would have seemed impossible months before. His breathing was steady, controlled. The weight that had once seemed crushing now felt like the perfect amount of mass to give power to his movements. Dax rode on the dragon's back, marveling at the transformation. This wasn't the same broken creature he had found in that crater. This was something magnificent, a fusion of ancient power and hard-earned wisdom. As they broke through the storm layer, Duraxis 9 spread out below them like a red jewel set in the cosmos. The twin suns hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. "This is it," Dax said softly, sliding down from Emberclaw's back. "This is where you remember what you were born to do." Emberclaw stood at the edge of the precipice, his silver scales now gleaming in the sunlight. The fat was gone, replaced by muscle that rippled with each breath. His wings, once cracked and broken, stretched wide and strong. But most importantly, his eyes burned with the inner fire that had made him legendary. "Fly," Dax whispered. Emberclaw looked down at the small human who had believed in him when no one else would. Then, with a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain, he leaped. For a moment, he fell. But then his wings caught the wind, and he soared. He flew with a grace and power that surpassed anything from his pampered past. He was no longer just a weapon of destruction, he was a force of nature, a living embodiment of redemption and second chances. As he circled the mountain peak, Emberclaw saw something that made his heart leap: ships on the horizon. King Velair's fleet, come to check on their discarded weapon. But they weren't seeing a broken, exiled has-been. They were seeing a dragon reborn. Emberclaw landed beside Dax, his chest heaving with exhilaration rather than exhaustion. The trainer smiled and patted the dragon's massive leg. "So," Dax said, adjusting his pack, "what do you say we go show them what real power looks like?" The dragon's answering roar could be heard across 3 star systems. It spoke of strength earned through struggle, of dignity reclaimed through dedication, and of a friendship that had transformed them both. Together, they took to the skies, not as master and weapon, but as partners who had found their true purpose among the stars. Some said later that when Emberclaw returned to face King Velair's fleet, he was no longer the same dragon who had been cast out. He was something greater, a phoenix rising from the ashes of his former self, carrying with him the knowledge that true strength comes not from never falling, but from choosing to rise again. And beside him always flew Dax, the trainer who had seen potential where others saw only failure, proving that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of faith. The end.